Have you ever forgiven someone and ended up being hurt even more because of it? It hurts, doesn't it? Just when you think the hardest part was the betrayal, the second arrow comes, the judgment of those who should have welcomed you. My name is Melissa Carter. I'm 44 years old, and what I'm going to tell you now isn't just a story of pain. It's a story of faith, of abandonment, of silencing, and of a forgiveness that scandalized even those who claimed to know God's grace. For a long time, I lived what many Christian women dream of: marriage, children, ministry, church. I believed I was protected within my faith, supported by brothers and sisters who walked with me in the name of the same God. But none of this protected me from betrayal. None of this prevented me from being left behind. And worse, none of this shielded me from judgment when I made the most difficult decision of my life, forgiving the one who destroyed my home. Have you ever been there? Have you ever tried to pick yourself up after a fall, and instead of outstretched hands, you were met with accusatory looks? Have you ever felt that within the church itself, the hurt woman is often also the guilty woman? My story is made up of moments you may know well: silent prayers, tears no one saw, and nights when only God knew what I was feeling. And even after choosing the path of mercy, I was called weak, stupid, and a disgrace by other Christian women. But what these people didn't know is that the real scandal wasn't the betrayal, it was the forgiveness. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. Maybe you're going through exactly this. Maybe there's someone in your life who needs to hear this story. Maybe you think it's the end, but this pain you feel could be the beginning of something much bigger. Because sometimes, when we think we're being broken, God is just beginning to rebuild in ways no one expects. Because sometimes, when we think we're being broken, God is just beginning to rebuild in ways no one expects. And if at any point in this story you felt your heart ache, if something here reminded you of your own journey or of someone you love, I want to ask you something very simple but very important. Click the like button on this video now. It may seem like just a small gesture, but believe me, when you like something, YouTube understands that this content is relevant, and show this video to more women who, like me, are trying to start over after an emotional earthquake. Sometimes all a woman needs is to hear that she's not alone. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. That's what unites us, this silent but powerful network of women who feel, fall, get up, and keep believing. So if this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most so far. I read everything. And who knows, maybe your story will also end up touching someone who's silent on the other side of the screen. Now, take a deep breath with me, because what comes next is the most delicate part of my story. It's where pain and love met, and nothing was ever the same again. Do you think forgiveness is always right? What if the one you forgive is the one who destroyed your home, your family, your faith? Well, that's what I did. And the consequences weren't what you expected. When everything came to light, there was no public outcry, no shouting, no confusion. It was an icy silence, an internal breakdown that can't be described in simple words. The woman who shared the worship service with me at church was the same woman who was sharing my bed with my husband. Not at the same time, of course, but you get the idea. The kind of pain that doesn't just hurt the soul, but questions your entire reality. What was true? What was a lie? How many times were they there, smiling together, while I gave myself completely to my family? It's behind the scenes that true transformation begins, when the mask of the perfect life falls away, and all that's left is you, God, and emptiness. The betrayal wasn't just marital. It was spiritual. It was emotional. It was social. I felt excluded from a system that until then had called me sister, as if the mistake had tarnished my identity, and my voice no longer held value. I felt like I'd been cast aside for a mistake I didn't make. And here comes a hidden truth that no one likes to say out loud. The woman betrayed within the church often becomes more inconvenient than the betrayer himself. It's as if her pain reminds everyone that the Christian world isn't as clean as it seems. And so, she needs to be silenced, ignored, discredited. But it was in this place of rejection that I began to understand the power of decisions. Because it's in the small, everyday choices that a new mindset begins to emerge. I could choose to be bitter, harbor hatred, justify my anger, and rightly so, but I chose to look within, to see myself as a daughter, not of the pastor, not of the church, but of God. The impact of this change was slow, painful, but liberating, because forgiveness didn't free me from the pain immediately, but it did free me from the emotional prison that kept me chained to the other person's mistakes. And here comes what few people understand. True forgiveness doesn't require apologies. It comes from within, and sometimes, the more silent it is, the more power it carries. Forgiving that man, that woman, and the entire structure that covered them was a lonely process, but profoundly revealing. I discovered things about myself that I never would have known if everything had remained as perfect as I imagined. But there is something even more essential here, something that few realize. I had been married for 17 years. I was the mother of 2 children, a boy and a girl, who were, and still are, my world. I had always been involved with the church. I coordinated women's meetings, ran the children's ministry, and was part of the intercession group. I woke up early, prayed, took care of the house, and held family devotions. It was a simple life, but full of purpose. I believed everything was firm, stable, and secure. I believed that when we follow the right principles, the right fruits would inevitably come. I believed that a woman of faith, dedicated and faithful to her home, was rewarded with a protected home. But life has its behind-the-scenes details, and often what's behind the scenes says more than what's shown from the pulpit. On the outside, I was the picture of a well-adjusted Christian woman, the one whose marriage inspires other sisters, who knows how to pray beautifully, who is patient with everything. But on the inside, there were small, almost invisible signs: long silences, distant glances, hugs that no longer felt warm. But how could I question whether the routine was being followed? How could I raise suspicions without seeming ungrateful for the blessing I claimed to be experiencing? The truth is, there's a subtle pressure for a Christian woman to smile even when she's bleeding. And I did, because believing that God was watching over me helped me endure everything, even the things I didn't fully understand. Over time, I began to notice changes I couldn't explain. More frequent business trips, my cell phone always face down, less time at home, less attendance at church, perfect excuses for everything. But no confession, no slip-ups, just that butterflies in my stomach, that intuition that whispers softly, something's wrong. And then comes a difficult decision: trust my instinct or ignore it out of faith. I chose to pray. I chose to fast. I chose to protect my home with the spiritual weapons I'd learned to wield since I was a girl. But sometimes, what feels like protection is actually denial. And for months, I denied what was already screaming right in front of me. It's curious how we associate stability with routine, as if doing everything right were insurance against chaos. But it isn't, because chaos sometimes arrives slowly, in small cracks, until eventually the whole structure collapses. And that's what happened: an emotional, spiritual, and familial collapse. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. And it wasn't what I discovered. It was how I reacted. And then the truth came out. Without warning, without a chance to prepare. Suddenly, everything I'd felt, but couldn't, prove materialized before my eyes. It was a small detail that revealed everything. A conversation barely ended, a forgotten notification on the screen, an exchange of glances that could no longer be disguised. What had previously been just intuition became confirmation. A sister from my own church, yes, from our small group, one of those who prayed with me, who raised their hands at Sunday services and spoke confidently of marital restoration. They'd been together for months. While I fought spiritually to protect what was mine, they secretly lived a story that denied everything faith should represent. It hurts, and not just because of the betrayal. It hurts because it dismantles everything you believe to be solid. Because when the shattering comes from within, from someone who shares the same faith, the same altar, the same songs, the impact is even deeper. It's as if your soul is being torn apart in a more silent, yet more cruel way. You don't just feel deceived. You feel shattered. And I felt that way, shattered. as if every part of me was being torn out with tweezers, little by little in slow motion. My mind starts to race. I start replaying every conversation, every absence, every time I was on my knees praying for a marriage that, behind the scenes, was already being betrayed. I found myself remembering dinners she'd attended, services she'd attended by me, prayer meetings where we'd exchanged requests and hugs. What was real? What was staged? It was like walking into a horror movie with characters pretending to be supporting characters when, in fact, they were the villains. But what tore me apart most was the silence, because when the truth came out, there was no confrontation, no regret, not even surprise. He simply said he was no longer happy and that he needed to find himself. Her? She fell silent. She disappeared from my sight as if her absence were a definitive answer. And the cruelest thing of all was realizing that for some it was just a marital problem, nothing to be alarmed about. Marriages end, they told me. People change. But no one spoke of the spiritual abyss it caused me. No one cared about the emotional impact on my children. No one stood up to defend the truth, or even to comfort someone who had been violently torn apart inside. It's at these times that we understand the difference between community and coexistence. Many live with you. Few walk with you. Very few feel your pain as if it were their own. And almost none are willing to take a stand when it involves discomfort. The truth is, the betrayal wasn't just his. It was the structure, the system, the mentality that prefers to maintain appearances rather than face the behind the scenes. And me? I stood there, trying to breathe in the midst of it all, having to be a mother, a housewife, a Christian, while the world fell apart. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. I wanted to scream, but at the same time, something inside me said, don't react as they expect. Don't destroy yourself to show that you've been destroyed. I needed to decide whether I would be the bitter woman or the transformed woman. But this decision didn't come quickly. It began there, amid the rubble of my dignity, amid the questions that still echoed unanswered. And it was in this silence that the most profound journey of my life began to take shape. I collapsed. It was as if I were dying, standing up. My body was there, doing chores, washing the dishes, watching my children. But inside, it was a constant echo of something that no longer existed. The ground disappeared. And I'm not speaking figuratively. It's real. You feel as if you've lost your bearings, as if what sustained you was no longer there. But the greatest pain wasn't even the betrayal. No, it was the silence. The silence of those who claimed to love me, of those who hugged me at the church door, of those who said family is God's plan, of those who celebrated my birthdays and my children's baptisms. Their silence was what screamed the loudest, because deep down, I thought there would at least be outrage, that someone would call it wrong, that somehow my pain would be recognized as legitimate. But what I found was a kind of polite neutrality, as if, by taking sides, people were breaking with an order they preferred to keep intact, even at the expense of the truth. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to lose the comfort of communion. And then I realized my suffering was inconvenient, and a wounded woman within the church who dares to say she is wounded ends up being treated as a problem to be contained, not as someone to be restored. It's at times like these that beautiful words lose their luster. Ready-made verses don't work. It will pass, hurts, because it's not just about what happened. It's about everything that's revealed afterward. The hypocrisy, the lack of depth in relationships, the lack of courage to confront what needs to be said. It's as if the mask of communion has slipped, and behind it lies the fragility of an environment that refuses to deal with reality. People didn't know where I fit in. I was no longer so-and-so's wife. She wasn't the recent convert either, and much less the woman with a testimony of victory. It was just me, broken, confused, with my faith shaken and my heart in pieces. At that point, my identity began to be crushed, because when everything you were was based on roles, wife, leader, intercessor, woman of faith, and those roles are brutally ripped away, what's left? Who am I without this marriage? Who am I without the ministry I led alongside him? Who am I when I don't even have the strength to pray out loud? The questions began to engulf me, and loneliness, the kind that enters without asking permission, became my only companion. There were sleepless nights, entire days without food, and tears that seemed to well up from the depths of my soul. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. There was a woman there, but it wasn't me anymore. It was a faded version, disfigured by pain, weakened by the feeling of abandonment. And no matter how much I knew the scriptures, no matter how much I read and reread about the comfort of the Spirit, it seemed to no longer resonate, as if there were a distance between what I knew and what I could feel. The disconnect between mind and spirit was real. I quoted the promises, but inside me, everything was suspended. No words seemed to make sense. No prayer seemed to rise. It's strange how faith can seem absent when pain hits with full force. I found myself there, in the middle of an invisible war, between what I believed and what I was experiencing, between the image of a strong woman everyone knew and the raw vulnerability of someone who no longer knew how to carry on. And it was precisely at that point, at the darkest depths of the pit, that something different began to happen. Not suddenly, not with thunderclaps or miraculous revelations, but with a whisper, a faint perception, something that was still tenuous, almost imperceptible, but real. And it was from that moment that my journey began to change direction. He left the house the following week, without much explanation, without drama, without even a backward glance. He grabbed some clothes, said something about needing some time, and closed the door. That door that, for years, had been the entrance to laughter, family prayers, promises made in the dim light. The sound of the lock echoed like a sentence, and in that moment, I understood that it wasn't just his presence that was leaving. This was everything I had built on the idea of permanence, because loving someone who decides to leave is a kind of emptiness that can't be put into words. But the cruelest part was yet to come. In the days that followed, as I tried to keep my children emotionally protected, as I fought the internal collapse that was robbing me of my breath, I waited. I waited for a call, a visit, a gesture of welcome from someone who always told me, "We're here for you." But the phone remained silent, and the doorbell didn't ring. No one, absolutely no one from our spiritual leadership came to me. No one to ask if I needed anything, if the children were okay, if I was eating, if I could pray. It was as if I'd been erased from the spiritual map, as if, without the title of so-and-so's wife, I was no longer useful, as if my suffering was too uncomfortable to fit within the halls of a temple that preaches love, grace, and compassion. And then comes the hidden truth I never wanted to see. Sometimes the religious structure is quick to restore the visible sinner, but slow, almost inert, to welcome the silent victim. Because when he appeared again, weeks later, alone at a Sunday service, he was greeted with discreet applause and restrained smiles, as if his absence had been merely a pause. No one confronted him. No one brought it up. He returned to the pews as if nothing had happened. And me? I was there, at home, heartbroken, having to explain to my children why their father wouldn't be having dinner with us that night. It's in this kind of backstage situation that the image maintenance mentality speaks louder than the truth, because confronting error requires courage, and keeping up appearances requires only silence. The emotional abandonment in this case wasn't just marital, it was collective, it was institutional, it was spiritual, and its impact went beyond the pain of separation. I found myself questioning my worth as a person, whether I was truly important to those people or just for the role I played there. It's a kind of revelation that changes the way you see everything: faith, community, purpose. I began to wonder if it was all based on appearances, if what was said at the altar was lived behind the scenes. And perhaps what shocked me most was realizing that, even surrounded by people for so many years, in the moment of deep pain, I was alone. Alone. That word took on weight, shape, and texture. It wasn't solitude, it was abandonment. The difference lies in the choice. Solitude is when you withdraw. Abandonment is when you're abandoned. And I was abandoned. By him, by leadership, by friendships that disappeared or chose to not get involved. I was forgotten as I tried to stay afloat. But it was in this void, in this space of silence and absence, that a different kind of strength began to emerge. A strength that no longer depended on the validation of others. a strength that no longer sought approval, but clarity. Because when everything that sustained you crumbles, what remains is essential. And the essential, however painful, is what truly transforms. It was in this process of invisible mourning that my inner journey began to take shape. It was during this process of invisible grief that my inner journey began to take shape. It wasn't easy. Nothing is. But something inside me refused to accept that this pain would be the end of my story. I didn't know exactly what would come next, but there was a silent conviction that it needed to be lived with purpose, with truth, and above all, with courage. And that's precisely why I'm here today, putting all this into words, not as someone who has won every battle, but as someone who has decided to no longer remain silent. Because I know I'm not alone. I know that on the other side of this screen, there are women who are also experiencing their own silences, their own deserts. Women who, like me, are trying to hold themselves together while everything seems to be falling apart. And if this topic resonates with you, if at some point this story touched something deep inside you, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, not out of vanity, not for numbers, but because this exchange matters, because your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content, real, profound, without forced spiritual filters. This is a safe space, a place where vulnerability isn't seen as weakness, but as part of the journey, where stories like mine, and perhaps yours, find an echo, a welcome, and perhaps even answers. So, if this embraces you in some way, if you want to continue walking with me through these truths that are often hidden between the pages of our Bibles and the shadows of our faith, sign up. We'll walk together. Because what began as a fall can indeed become redemption. But to do so, it takes courage to look within and not look away. And that's exactly what I started doing, even without knowing where it would lead me. I thought that after everything, after the abandonment, the silence, the pain exposed like an open wound, there would come acceptance, a shoulder to cry on, a listening ear, perhaps even a sincere gesture of solidarity. But what I found was a different kind of pain, one that hurts not with shouts, but with whispers. I heard from women in the church, some who sat with me for years in the pews, phrases that came disguised as advice, but carried hidden judgment. Maybe you've stopped being a wife. Pray more, dear. Take care of your home. And each of these words, spoken with sweet voices and pious faces, sounded like small knives, sharpened by religiosity, as if the fault were mine, and as much as my mind knew it was unfair, something inside me absorbed it. Because when you're fragile, every word weighs heavily. Every sideways glance feels like a diagnosis, and that created even deeper cracks in my identity. I began to wonder if, in fact, I had failed as a woman, if I could have done more, if being tired, exhausted, overwhelmed with children, ministry, home, and work was justification enough for him to look for another. This is the emotional trap many of us face, transforming the victim's pain into the victim's own responsibility. It's a silent but devastating distortion. And the most contradictory thing is that all of this came from an environment that preached unconditional love, grace, and empathy. But all it took was for my story to deviate from the traditional script for judgment to set in. Subtle, polished, but present. The impact was deeper than I expected. I didn't just doubt myself as a woman. I began to doubt my faith. If my pain didn't generate compassion among those who claimed to know God's heart, had He also abandoned me? That's when I began to see something I'd ignored until then, the difference between spirituality and mindset. Not every religious discourse comes from a healed heart. Not every word of wisdom is truly caring. Sometimes it's laden with outdated patterns, misinterpretations, and poorly treated wounds projected onto others. And without realizing it, the church itself can become a hostile environment for those experiencing pain that defies control. The woman who forgives the unforgivable, who continues to believe when everyone else gives up, who keeps standing when everything falls apart. This woman causes discomfort because she breaks the cycle. She reveals a strength that doesn't fit in pre-packaged boxes, and it was this revelation that began to change my mindset. Little by little, I began to understand that I didn't need to prove myself to anyone, that my journey was unique, that a transformation was happening, even in the midst of chaos, and that the opinions of others could no longer define the narrative of my story. Because there was something deeper, more intimate, more true blossoming in the place where before there had been only pain. And it was precisely at that point that something inside me began to awaken, something I hadn't known existed until then. I cried at night, hidden away, lying in the dark, hugging my pillow, trying to stifle my sobs so as not to wake my children. During the day, I smiled with my eyes downcast, wore what remained of my dignity, and showed up at services with a strength I didn't feel, but inside, I was in mourning. A mourning no one recognized, because there was no coffin, no wake, no official farewell. It was an invisible, silent mourning that accompanied me in every gesture, in every glance I averted as I passed. In the eyes of the church, I was just the sister who couldn't hold on to her husband, the one who, somehow, left the door open, the one who, perhaps, had gotten lost in life's commitments and forgotten to take care of the most important part. I heard it between the lines. I felt it in the looks. I noticed it in the subtle distancing of my ministry friends, in the invitations that stopped coming, in the prayer circles I was no longer a part of. It was as if my pain bothered me, as if what happened to me was contagious, a silent warning that anyone could be next, and so I needed to be kept at a distance. The cruelest thing about invisible grief is that it's not allowed to exist. No one gives you space to feel. You're pressured to overcome it prematurely. They tell you God will restore, that you need to believe, that the joy of the Lord is your strength. And yes, I know it is. But there were days when that strength seemed unattainable. Because when you're thrust into a reality you didn't choose, everything inside you screams for explanations. But the explanations don't come. What comes are the tasks, the obligations, the routine that continues, the bills that arrive, the children who cry, the dishes that pile up, and the heart that tightens, withdraws, becomes silent. It was in this place of silence that I began to observe the layers of my own soul. I began to realize how accustomed I had become to living for others, to meeting expectations, to meeting demands, and without realizing it, I had disconnected from myself. The Melissa that existed before marriage, before leadership, before titles, was buried beneath years of surrender and little listening, and now, in that empty space left by abandonment, I began to hear a voice that was not one of reproof, but of calling, a gentle yet firm summons to return to the essentials, not the essentials of religion, but the essentials of identity. Who was I when no one was watching? Who was I when everything that defined me had been stripped away? This process was lonely, but it was also a revelation, because invisible grief forced me to stop, to face the truths I'd tried to push through with memorized verses and church calendar commitments. It was there, at the bottom of my emotional well, that I realized pain is one of God's sharpest tools for unearthing what's hidden. And there is no transformation without excavation. There is no reconstruction without ruin. Little by little, even without realizing it, I was making decisions. Small, subtle decisions, but they were reshaping my mindset. Things like allowing myself to rest, saying no, stop justifying how I feel, choosing who I talk to, relearning to enjoy my own company. It still hurt. It was still difficult. But that grief, which began as a burden, began to take on another name within me, transition, a crossing point between who I was and who I was becoming. Not because I wanted to go through it, but because now that it had happened, I couldn't let this pain go to waste. And it was in that moment, at this intimate crossroads between what was left behind and what was not yet visible, that something began to blossom. A still fragile but present feeling that there was something more in store for me, something that didn't depend on what I had lost, but on what I was about to discover. No pastor reached out to me, no leader, no ministry coordinator, no figure who, for years, watched me serve, weeping in prayer for others, carrying a burden that often wasn't even mine. There was no message asking if I was okay, if I needed help, a conversation, a human gaze, only silence, a heavy, awkward silence that told me, without words, that I was no longer useful, that my pain was too uncomfortable to expose. As if the best solution was to leave me alone, out of the spotlight, until I finally shut myself up. But what shocked me most was when he returned, not alone. He returned with her, the one who walked with me in intercession groups, the one who called me sister in Christ. They sat together in services as if nothing had happened, and it wasn't long before they began actively participating in the programs. And that's when the smiles came, the warm greetings, the words of encouragement, as if they had returned from a difficult journey and were now ready to begin again. I saw with my own eyes leaders shaking hands, exchanging hugs, making space. It was as if history had been rewritten by another narrative, where the behind the scenes no longer mattered, and the appearance of restitution was enough to silence any moral discomfort. And the cruelest thing about all this is that when you're a woman, when you're the betrayed party, you're still expected to maintain your composure. You can't be too indignant, you can't overreact, you can't be absent for too long, nor too visible. Everything you do is monitored, interpreted, labeled, and when you choose silence, they say you've withdrawn. When you choose to take a stand, they say you're bitter. When you continue to love, they call you weak, and when you forgive, they doubt your intelligence. It's a kind of judgment that isn't shouted, it's insinuated, and this kind of judgment, coming from those who preach mercy, has a profound impact because it wounds the spirit. It was in this context that I began to understand the difference between institution and purpose. The church I knew as a structure was unable to handle my pain, but my faith wasn't grounded in it. It was grounded in God, and that's what kept me going. Holding on to this truth was one of the hardest decisions because it required letting go of idealization. I had to accept that some people wouldn't defend me, even knowing what happened, that some pastors wouldn't listen to me, even after seeing my dedication, and that some structures prefer to maintain convenient alliances rather than commit to the truth. This was one of the hardest revelations of my journey, and also one of the most liberating, because from the moment I stopped waiting for recognition, I began to find space to heal what truly mattered, my identity. I stopped wondering why they didn't welcome me and began to ask what God wanted to show me with all of this. And in this inner space, where the noise of others no longer distracted me, something began to align within me. It was as if a new territory was being prepared, still invisible, but full of possibilities. Possibilities that didn't depend on anyone's permission, nor on positions, nor on the spotlight. Possibilities that came directly from God to me. And the more I looked within, the more I understood that silence, although painful, was teaching me to listen to another voice, a voice that doesn't manipulate, doesn't demand, doesn't punish, but calls. And that voice was about to lead me to a decision that would change everything. I considered leaving my faith. It wasn't a passing thought. It was real, sincere, painful. It began as a whisper in my mind, like a weary voice saying, "It doesn't make sense anymore." And little by little, that whisper became an argument, a lament, almost a rupture. I wondered how a just God could allow this, how he could see me being torn apart inside and still remain silent. I began to feel forgotten, like a letter left on the table, ignored. And perhaps this was the most distressing thing, the contrast between everything I believed and everything I lived, between the promises I had repeated so many times and the emptiness that now resided within me. The sensation was of being suspended, as if I'd fallen into a place beyond logic, a place where faith and pain were so intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. It was in this space, this spiritual pit no one sees, that something unexpected happened. An ordinary day, devoid of worship, no background praise, no emotional preparation. I was at home, sitting on the couch, my heart turned to dust, and I left a video playing on my phone almost by accident. I don't even know why I left it playing. Maybe it was an automatic attempt to fill the silence. And it was there, in the middle of that sermon, that the phrase hit me like a punch to the soul. Forgiveness. Frees those who carry the burden. In that moment, I broke. The kind of brokenness that isn't pretty. I sobbed, as if every part of me was crying out for help. It was an old, choked, pent-up cry. It wasn't just about what they'd done to me. It was about everything I'd kept bottled up. The unanswered questions, the prayers without return, the hugs that didn't come, the condemning looks, the hurtful words. Everything came flooding back. And in that moment, without a script, without a set, without an audience, I realized I wasn't alone, that God hadn't abandoned me. He was just waiting for me in the place I least wanted to visit, the place of surrender. It was there that my mindset began to transform. It wasn't a theological shift. It wasn't a new doctrine. It was something internal, intimate, a realignment of the soul. I understood that forgiveness wasn't an answer for the other, but a liberation for me. That forgiving wasn't minimizing what they did, nor forgetting, nor justifying. It was letting go of the weight, stopping bleeding inside every day for something that was no longer in my control, because holding on to the pain had become a kind of habit. I carried the suffering like someone carrying an identity, as if that pain defined me, as if it were my only way of being seen. But there, in that deep tear, came the revelation. I could decide. I could choose. I didn't have to remain trapped in all that just because they hurt me. That was the key that turned. A silent but powerful decision. A step out of the prison that had been imposed on me, but which I also helped to keep locked up. And that moment wasn't the end of the pain, nor the beginning of complete healing. It was the beginning of a conscious journey. Of that journey that begins with an intimate choice and is built one day at a time. From that moment on, I began to see everything through different eyes. The same people, the same places, the same story, but now through a new lens, a lens of freedom. And it was this freedom that began to show me a new kind of strength, one that doesn't scream, that doesn't need to prove anything, but that simply remains, firm, serene, indestructible. And this strength was about to lead me to a decision that no one understood, and yet it was the most correct step I could have taken. Forgiveness wasn't an event. It didn't have a set date. It didn't happen in a specific service, nor was it wrapped in pretty words. It was a process, one of those we choose not for comfort, but for emotional survival, because holding a grudge killed me a little more each day. It was like carrying a suitcase full of rocks while trying to run. You might even manage a few steps, but soon the weight paralyzes you. Then I understood that if I wanted to stay alive, not just exist, I would have to start letting go, little by little, with pain, with tears, but letting go. The hardest part wasn't just forgiving what they did to me. The hardest part was forgiving, knowing I'd never receive an apology, knowing there'd never be any acknowledgement, no conversation of regret, no sincere, "I'm sorry," nothing. They moved on with their lives while I picked up the pieces of mine. And yet, I had to decide. Either I fed the hatred or I breathed freedom. And every day, sometimes more than once a day, I had to choose again. Choosing not to respond mentally. Not to imagine fictional dialogues where I said everything I wanted. Choosing not to rehearse revenge, not to feed the desire for justice my way. It was like learning to walk again, one step at a time, falling and getting up. There's a hidden truth in forgiveness that few people talk about. It's never fair at first glance. It seems unfair to let go of the person who hurt you. It seems unfair to let go of the pain when it's the only thing connecting you to what you lost. But forgiveness isn't about immediate justice. It's about profound liberation, not of the other person, of yourself. Because while you wait for the other person to feel what you feel, you chain yourself to their absence. And I could no longer afford that luxury. My children watched me. Life went on. And inside me, despite my exhaustion, there was a flame that insisted on not extinguishing. I knew that story couldn't end in bitterness. And here comes another important point. True forgiveness has no audience. It happens behind the scenes. No one applauds. No one notices. And sometimes, when you say you've forgiven, you still hear criticism. I heard that I was weak, that I was giving up, that I was making a fool of myself. But no one knew what that forgiveness gave me back inside. It gave me lightness. It gave me dignity. It gave me the ability to breathe without weight, to sleep peacefully, to look in the mirror without seeing just the wounded woman, but also the woman rebuilding. This decision, though so intimate, had a visible impact. I began to react differently, to respond differently, to choose differently. It wasn't magic. It was a decision, a mindset that transformed as I freed myself from the victim narrative and began to see the journey of overcoming. And it was precisely at this point that I began to discover what it truly meant to win without needing to defeat the other. Because there was a victory that wasn't achieved through confrontation, but through surrender. And this surrender was what led me to the next step, a step that not everyone understood, but which, for me, was the key to a new stage. When I said I forgave, it was as if I had made another mistake, not before God, but before people. I hoped that perhaps my choice would be understood as maturity, as liberation, or at least as a gesture of courage. But what I heard was the opposite. I was called weak, naive, a silly believer, and most painfully, they said I shamed Christian women. Yes, those same women who had once walked beside me, hands raised in church services, singing about grace and restoration. Now, they looked at me with contempt, or at the very least, perplexity, because I hadn't taken revenge, I hadn't exposed myself, I hadn't hardened myself, and that, to some people, seemed unacceptable. There's a hidden truth about forgiveness that no one tells you. It's not always celebrated. Sometimes it's misunderstood, especially when you're a woman. We're expected to adopt a stance of either revolt and explosive strength or absolute passivity and silence, but forgiving consciously, lucidly, without losing dignity seems to confuse those who haven't yet understood what emotional freedom is. They said I was giving a bad testimony, as if choosing to let go were shameful, as if, by not taking revenge, I was diminishing the gravity of what they did to me. But no one there experienced what I experienced. No one carried my heart in their hands, and only I knew the weight I released that day. It's curious how the same environment that preaches unconditional love often doesn't know how to handle practical love. Loving one's enemy is beautiful on paper, in verse, in a Sunday sermon. But when someone truly decides to walk by this principle, everything becomes strange, almost uncomfortable. It was as if my forgiveness disrupted the narrative the group had already constructed, because the expected script was different, that of the wounded, angry woman who isolates herself, who denounces, who screams. I chose another path, not because it was better, but because this was the path God built, for me, step by step, a path of rebuilding from within, away from the spotlight. This choice distanced me from some people and brought me closer to myself, because when we stop seeking approval, we begin to hear more clearly what truly matters. The forgiveness I offered wasn't an attempt to appear spiritual. It was survival. It was a conscious choice. It was a decision not to allow pain to define my identity. And although many haven't understood, and perhaps never will, I know what it brought. Me inside. A kind of peace that isn't negotiable. A kind of strength that doesn't depend on external recognition. And the curious thing is that even in this environment of judgment and noise, it was in this same context that my identity began to be reconfigured, because I needed to look within and ask, who am I when no one applauds me? Who am I when my actions are not validated, but questioned? The answer didn't come all at once, but it began to emerge precisely in this contrast, in this friction between what was expected of me and what God was leading me to be. And it was then that something within me took hold in a way I could never again ignore. I asked myself, was I wrong for loving too much? For still believing in restoration, even when everything around me said otherwise? At times, doubt overpowered faith. Because when you're called foolish for forgiving, weak for continuing to believe, alienated for maintaining hope, it's inevitable not to internalize some of these accusations. I began to reevaluate my decisions, my feelings, my reactions. I began to distrust my sensitivity, my way of caring, my surrender to everything I did, in my marriage, at church, in life. It was as if my very essence was being put to the test. And the question that echoed within me was, to what extent is my heart a gift, and where did it become too vulnerable? It was then that I began to face head-on a truth I had long avoided. My identity could no longer be tied to the behavior of others, nor to how they treated me, nor to what they said about me, not even to my roles within the church or my emotional ties. I needed to rediscover who I was, without titles, without roles, without the gaze of others shaping my responses. And this rediscovery didn't come with flowers and a soft soundtrack. It came with silence, with confrontation, with a revision of my thoughts. It was as if I were reprogramming my own mindset, slowly, cautiously, but firmly. My faith also underwent this sieve, and not in the sense of denying God, but of understanding how much I had mixed my spiritual image with the acceptance of others. Discovering this was a shock, but also a relief, because when we remove faith from social expectations, it blossoms in a purer, more intimate, more genuine way. And within this new terrain, I began to discover a strength that no longer depended on performance, a spirituality that didn't demand I always be strong, but that embraced me in my weaknesses. It was in this inner place that I began to rebuild myself. And this reconstruction didn't come with formulas or ready-made phrases. It came with the presence of God and with the presence of myself. For the first time in a long time, I stopped trying to be what was expected of me and began to be who I truly was. This shift had a direct impact on how I saw myself as a woman. For years, I thought being a Christian woman was essentially about silently enduring everything. It was about being the pillar of the home, the peace in the chaos, the one who always understands, the one who always lends a hand. And yes, there's nobility in that. But there's also the danger of losing yourself in this overgiving. I needed to understand that I wasn't any less of a woman of God for setting boundaries, that I wasn't any less spiritual for saying it hurt, that I didn't need to give up on myself to be accepted by a system that only applauds you when you nullify yourself. It was a subtle but profound liberation, and it began when I stopped seeking validation from those who never understood my heart. It was at this turning point that my vision began to clear, and along with it came a courageous decision, one that would change the course of my story. On the loneliest days, when even the sound of my own voice seemed distant, it was the Bible that sustained me, not as a religious book of automatic promises, but as a living spring that visited me in the silence. I didn't read as I used, with plans and organized markings. I read as if seeking relief, as if leafing through the pages in search of air, of meaning, of a verse that would remind me that I was still alive inside. And there, between familiar chapters and words that had previously gone unnoticed, I began to perceive another layer of God's presence. It was no longer that faith of the collective, of the cult, of the movement. It was a raw faith, personal, intense, as if He drew near without demanding anything, simply staying there by my side when no one else wanted to. It was the Holy Spirit who embraced me on those nights when my pillow was the only thing listening to my pain. Those moments when the dark room felt like the only safe place and the rest of the world seemed to go on as normal, as if nothing had happened. He didn't bring me all the answers, and truthfully, I didn't even have any questions anymore. I just needed to feel seen, and that's exactly what I felt, that even in my abandonment I was noticed, not as a statistic, nor as a sister in trial, but as a daughter who could be on her knees without words, who could sob without explanation, who could simply exist in that moment without needing to justify her pain. That presence changed everything, not magically, but truly. Realizing God in solitude brought me a kind of strength that isn't built with catchphrases, but with experience. Because when everything disappears, friends, ministries, invitations, smiles, and only He remains, you begin to see things differently. And this perspective changes the way you react, decide, and choose. He showed me that I didn't need to pretend to be well to be loved, that I didn't need to be whole to be used, that I didn't need to have all the answers to keep walking. Grace, which I'd talked about so much before, finally stopped being just a doctrine and became sustenance. Mercy stopped being a concept and became bread. And there, in the shadows of my pain, a revelation visited me. There is an intimacy with God that only arises in deserts. This was the part of the journey where I realized the invisible impact of the choices we make when no one is watching. Because it's easy to make good decisions when there's applause, when there's cheering, when there's an audience. But it's in the hidden world, when you decide to love even when hurt, to forgive even when misunderstood, to continue even when powerless, that something inside you truly changes. And no one can take that something away. It's the kind of transformation that can't be copied or accelerated, a daily, secret, sacred construction. That's how I began to understand that my strength wasn't born from what I did, but from those who walked with me in silence. And along this path, I rediscovered parts of myself I didn't even know were lost. Parts that, little by little, showed me that starting over wouldn't be the same as before. It would be even more genuine. Today I started over, and it wasn't. The way many imagine, with a perfect setting or a new story constructed to erase the previous one. I started over with visible scars, but with a clean heart, not as the betrayed woman, but as the healed woman. And this difference changes everything. Because when we stop defining ourselves by what was done to us and begin to see ourselves through what God rebuilt within us, the past loses its power to imprison us. I am living proof that it is possible to rise from the dust with dignity. And, what's more, it is possible to look back without desire for revenge, without fear, without shame, only with gratitude for the process, even though it was so painful. This new beginning wasn't a leap. It was a journey, a path paved with conscious decisions, often solitary, but aligned with a new mindset. I had to choose to position myself as a warrior, not as a victim of life. This doesn't mean I stopped feeling pain, but it does mean that pain is no longer my identity. I looked at everything I lost: trust, home, friends, stability, and understood that not everything that leaves our lives is a loss. Sometimes it's deliverance. Sometimes it's a disguised redirection, a revelation about the behind the scenes of something that, on the outside, seemed perfect, but inside had long been compromised. This kind of transformation isn't immediately visible. It happens behind the scenes of your soul, while you wash dishes with tears in your eyes, while you comfort your children with a choked voice, while you refuse the urge to prove your worth to those who don't deserve it. For me, starting over was just that, a series of small internal confrontations, choosing to believe when everything said it didn't make sense, choosing to build, even without help, choosing to be good, even after being hurt, because there's a kind of strength that comes after a fall, a silent but solid strength, the strength of someone who no longer needs to be seen as perfect, but who also refuses to be seen as weak. And it was with this strength that I began to say no to everything that diminished me, no to guilt that wasn't mine, no to the judgments hidden in advice, no to the idea that forgiveness is weakness, and most of all, no to the narrative they tried to write for me, because I learned that only God has authority over my story. The rest are versions. And if there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that dignity doesn't come from what you preserve. It comes from what you endure and yet refuse to become. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become like those who hurt me, and perhaps that was my greatest victory. I continue rebuilding, but no longer carrying rubble. Today I carry purpose. I carry vision. I carry peace. And that's worth more than any explanation I could have demanded back then. I understood that living as a warrior is knowing that the greatest battle always takes place within us, and that when we win from within, what's outside no longer defines us. This is the kind of truth no one can take away from you. And when it settles in your heart, something begins to be born, something new, full of meaning, and that's exactly what began to form within me, something that, over time, would leave its mark on others as well. If you've been betrayed, silenced, or judged, I want you to know you are not alone. Even if everything around you seems to scream otherwise, even if the looks in your eyes accuse you without saying anything, even if words of support don't come or come laden with judgment disguised as advice, your pain is valid, even if they try to minimize, spiritualize, or rationalize what you feel. There is a safe place within God's heart where this pain can exist without being denied, a place where you can fall apart without being corrected, where you can heal without rushing, where you can be heard without having to explain every tear. And I know there are times when silence hurts the most, when you realize the people who should walk beside you look away, when the ones you thought would protect you choose the comfort of omission. but there's a truth that sustains you, even when the ground disappears. God sees, and He doesn't just see, He cares. He doesn't ignore the behind-the-scenes details of your story. He doesn't dismiss what's been done in the shadows. He doesn't close His eyes to what they've tried to hide under the carpet of religious veneer. And more than that, He also doesn't condone structures that stifle the truth to maintain their reputation. This was something I had to learn, even unintentionally, that there is a God who walks behind the scenes, even when the stage is empty. If I could tell you something, woman to woman, I would say, don't doubt who you are because of what someone did to you. Don't allow someone's betrayal to define your self-image. You remain whole in God's eyes, even when everything around you seems broken. And as contradictory as it may seem, it is precisely in these broken pieces that reconstruction begins. You don't need to have all the answers today, nor know what the exact next step will be, but you need to remember that there is a tomorrow, and that today's pain has no authority to hinder God's plan for your life. You are not weak for feeling, nor foolish for having loved, nor guilty for having trusted. There is beauty in your surrender, even if it has been betrayed. There is purpose amidst the chaos, and yes, there is healing for what now seems impossible to touch without bleeding. My journey has shown me this, and if it was possible for me, not because I am strong, but because I decided not to give up, it can be possible for you too. You don't need to become hard to survive. You need to remember who you are. And this remembering is more than rational. It is spiritual. It is profound. It is a return to your essence before the wounds. And even if no one else recognizes what you carry, even if your story doesn't make headlines, even if your cry is only known to God, He will use it all. Every tear, every silence, every injustice, all of it will be part of something greater, not because the pain itself has value, but because what He builds from it transforms. It transforms you. It transforms your vision. It transforms the environment around you. And, in due time, what makes you hide today will be exactly what God will use to lift others up. Forgiving doesn't mean accepting what was done, and that was one of the greatest lessons I learned on this journey. For a long time, I thought that by forgiving, I was giving in, that I was overcoming myself, ignoring the pain, as if to say, it's okay, you can do it again. But that's not the case. True forgiveness doesn't erase the mistake. It doesn't rewrite history. It doesn't transform the villain into the hero. Forgiveness, in fact, doesn't change the past. It heals your future. And that difference changes everything. Because when I carried the hurt, I believed it, protected me, as if holding on to anger was a way to not forget. But the hidden truth behind this is that bitterness doesn't protect you. It traps you. It suffocates. It paralyzes. And I understood that holding on to it only allowed what hurt me to continue to have a place within me, even after it was gone from my life. This freed me, realizing that forgiveness is a courageous decision to not let yourself be defined by pain. It's when you take back control, not to manipulate anyone, but to stop being manipulated by what happened. The impact of this choice was more profound than any external reaction, because the world around me didn't change immediately. People didn't start treating me differently. Injustice, in a way, was still in the air, but inside me, everything began to breathe again. I began to dream without fear, praying with more ease, looking in the mirror, and recognizing a woman who, even hurt, remained standing. This wasn't easy. It was the result of many behind-the-scenes situations that no one saw, of sleepless nights, of solitary decisions, of silences where only God was witness. And that's why I'm convinced today, forgiving was the most revolutionary act I could have done, because it was a cry for freedom in an environment that expected me to be just another resigned victim. It was the turning point that stopped me from continuing to live, trapped in the narrative of what had been done to me. I no longer wanted to be remembered as the woman who was betrayed. I wanted to be remembered as the woman who, despite being betrayed, chose to move on whole. That's strength, that's faith, that's a healed identity. I also learned that forgiveness doesn't need to be understood by everyone. In fact, it almost never is, because the world still confuses forgiveness with weakness. It still looks on in astonishment when it sees someone letting go of the weight they have every right to carry. But for me, that's true courage. And courage sometimes is doing the opposite of what's expected of you. It's refusing the role of victim. It's breaking with the logic of pain as a tool for validation. Because if there's one thing I've understood throughout this journey, it's that living with a light heart is expensive. But living trapped in hurt is even more expensive. Choosing emotional freedom was a shift in mindset. One of those decisions no one can make for you. Only you know what you carry. Only you know the impact of what was done. And only you can choose whether this will shape who you are or whether it will just be part of your story, but not your destiny. I chose that my story would have marks, yes, but they would be healing scars, not open wounds. And this kind of healing can't be bought, inherited, or imitated. It's built, one choice at a time, one confrontation at a time, one forgiveness at a time. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't always pretty. There were moments when I almost backed down, when anger hit hard, when missing what I dreamed of hurt more than reality. But what sustained me was understanding that I didn't need to continue carrying what God was already willing to help me let go of. He never forced me to forgive. He invited me, and I accepted. And accepting that invitation was like opening a door to something new, something that was waiting for me, something that would give everything I'd experienced up until that point, including the pain, a new meaning. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "I choose healing." Share this video with someone struggling to forgive. And remember, God still writes new beginnings, even when everything seems over. These words are not just a symbolic closing. They carry the power of a transformation that took place within me and which now extends to you, watching. It is the end of a period of reconstruction and the beginning of something greater, a journey of faith that is not based on pleasing others, but on following the truth that God revealed behind the scenes of my pain. From the moment I chose to forgive, I stopped living under the weight of the past and began to receive in the present what was previously denied me: peace, purpose, inner renewal. The decision to write this story, to tell it without curtains or perfect spiritual edits, has a purpose: to show that regaining dignity doesn't depend on others, but on an internal decision. And it's this decision that can impact your life too. If you felt touched, if you somehow recognized your own journey between the lines of what I've told, know that you're not alone. What I experienced, the betrayal, the cloaked judgment, the invisible grief, the institutional silence, the forgiveness without an audience, was part of a narrative that, until then, had been hidden behind the scenes. But it has power, the power to transform. I understand that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or accepting what was done. It means choosing to live free from bitterness, with a renewed mindset, a process that defies the logic of the world, but that frees the soul. And it was in this process that I discovered true freedom, not the absence of pain, but the choice not to be defined by it, the strength born of each conscious decision, to forgive, to let go, to begin again, became a living testament that even in the darkest scenarios, there is light ahead. Your story matters, your silence matters, but it can also become a voice, like mine did. And if this story resonates with you, if something has changed in your outlook, share it in the comments. I choose healing. This simple phrase can be an act of liberation for you. It can be a declaration of faith, even when you don't know how a new beginning will unfold. It can be a courageous step on a journey that's still ongoing. Often, the fear of moving forward with one's decisions is sustained by a lack of example. I'm here saying honestly, living as a warrior doesn't require you to be perfect. It requires you to remain true to yourself. It requires you to defend your dignity, your truth, even when external understanding fails. And if you're reading this, perhaps it's time to choose differently, to rebuild not on false expectations, but based on the foundation that remains, who you are at your core. So, if that betrayed woman within you still finds it impossible to forgive without losing, know that healing is real, purpose is real, restoration, as far as I've experienced it, is also real. God still writes new beginnings, even when the human landscape seemed to have decreed an end. And this can also be the beginning of your new phase.